Good afternoon, class. I'm checking in with you as I said I would at the end of our time together this morning, and I wanted to just go a little further. Most of you were in class today, and those of you who were know that we spent the latter half of the class discussing questions from the reading, and the central focus of our time together today was this notion of decolonization. And this is a rather short period, based on other periods of time that we have studied thus far in our unit on inequality. We've studied things like industrialization and civilization and imperialism, all of which were phenomena that tended to have pretty long periods of time. Decolonization is a brief period for the most part that follows World War II, and we're looking really at a period of time that is a couple decades in duration. The high tide of decolonization took place between 1945 and 65. And anyway, I want to just spend a little time. I'm not going to take too much of your time discussing this, but I do want to put some finishing touches on what we had together today, our time together today. So I spent a little time today going over sort of the big picture of inequality and some of the different historical stages that we have used to sort of help explain this phenomenon of how much of the world's wealth and resources and innovation and food security, things of that nature, have tended to be concentrated in certain world regions. So I'll pivot from that and move on to things that we weren't able to spend as much time on. So here's our objective, looking at the relationship between empires and their imperial possessions, how those were changed following dramatic events of the mid-20th century. So we spent time today discussing these first two questions, but we didn't quite get to the third. And the third question was, what special concerns made it difficult for imperial powers to loosen their grip upon their colonial possessions following World War II? Touched upon this briefly in class, but really it's important to note that in the big picture of the global order following World War II, many of the countries that were powerful global players on the eve of World War II had since found themselves not a first-rate power in the aftermath or the decades following World War II. So great powers like Britain, Germany, France, even lesser powers like the Netherlands, Italy, so on and so forth, are going to wake in the years after World War II to realize that their standing and power in the world was no longer what it had once been. Now, this made it a particularly difficult challenge, both politically and economically, for a country like Great Britain or France or Italy to relinquish or turn over their control of their colonial possessions. In some ways, these were the last external symbols of their once glorious power in the storied traditions of these European nation states. Because now, of course, power will be focused primarily on the United States in the West and on the Soviet Union in the East. And many of these other former colonial powers will find themselves wondering what, if any, sort of significance they will have in the global order of things following World War II. So, again, colonial possessions were an important symbol, perhaps, of a changing world, and they were a sign of power in the world before, but they were becoming less tenable, less feasible in the world after World War II. So the Cold War had an incredible impact on the process of decolonization. And really, if you were to look at events immediately following World War II, one would have thought that the prospects of these former colonial possessions receiving independence would have been very good. And of course, some of them do go forward and receive their independence, places like India, and we'll see various examples in places like Africa and Asia. However, it became a situation where it was not so fast. And if you remember, during World War II, the United States, under the leadership of President FDR and members of his administration, were calling attention to the hypocrisy or inconsistency of, here we have the Allied powers going to war against a fascist Nazi regime of Germany, and to a lesser extent Japan and Italy. And yet among the Allied powers themselves, countries like Great Britain, France, there are colonial possessions, people who are being essentially told, people who are being denied their own rights to determine their government for themselves. So the United States played upon this, and really after World War II, the emergence was that decolonization should go forward. However, and let me actually go back, the however here is the United States awakes to the post-World War II era and realizes that as one of two global superpowers, along with the Soviet Union, it has a tremendous interest and a tremendous stake in the stability and security of this post-World War II world. And so what the United States starts to do is make exceptions to some of its political principles. Its political principles, of course, are democracy and freedom and popular sovereignty, that the people who live in an area should be able to have a voice in determining that area's government. But the United States feared that if it stripped particularly Western European countries of its colonial possessions, it might be creating an unstable world order. Meaning, if France becomes weak, if Great Britain becomes weak, if West Germany becomes weak, perhaps these weakened European countries will find greater appeal in communism. Or perhaps if they become weaker, they won't be strong allies that the United States needs in this new Cold War era. So some of the political principles of the United States start to seem pretty compromised. In 1950, the relatively newly created United Nations, which had only existed since the end of World War II, puts forth a powerful statement. And that statement is essentially one that says, race, the concept of race, there's nothing biological or natural about it. It is strictly a social construct. And on its face, I mean, that's a pretty dramatic statement, and it was at the time. But the way in which it proves significant here is that, okay, if there is no difference between the world's races, if we are in fact all human with the same DNA and similar natural capabilities and origins, then we have to take a closer look at what colonialism and imperialism have done to the spread of wealth and opportunity around the globe. Inequality, if race is a human construct and there's nothing natural about some groups of people achieving at this level and deserving this level of wealth and resources and innovation and share of the global food supply, so on and so forth. And then there is now no longer a justification for some people experiencing the world at a much lower level of wealth and prosperity. Then that means we have to ask ourselves questions, where does this inequality come from? And the short answer to that becomes, well, it has to do with colonialism and imperialism, and how certain regions of the world have essentially had their circumstances dictated for them by powerful colonial and imperial rule. And so this 1950 statement on race becomes a rather significant one. Now, this question of why decolonization, the efforts by by regions of the world that have been colonized by European countries, they're going to become more forceful after 1950 precisely because the promise and excitement that colonized peoples had after World War II about the chances and prospects of them achieving their independence are now starting to become less certain. The United States has backtracked a little bit and determined that, you know what, as much as decolonization makes sense in principle, and as much as it's consistent with the political values of the United States, the practical and pragmatic aspects of decolonization are perhaps not quite as acceptable by the United States. And so after a few years of waiting, watching, and hoping that decolonization would naturally happen, many regions of the world, many colonies of the European colonizers start to say, enough of this, we're going to take matters into our own hands. And we see examples of this like in Vietnam, where Ho Chi Minh leads a successful independence effort. First, it was actually led against the Japanese during World War II. But then when France comes back to try to reestablish claim to its colonial possessions, Ho Chi Minh leads a successful independence effort against the French. They leave in 1954 with the fall of Dien Bien Phu, and then it's from that time that the United States takes over, largely filling a vacuum out of fear that perhaps Vietnam would fall to communism, which it quite likely would have if it had been left. But the U.S. policies of containment prevent the United States from accepting the decolonization of Vietnam for fear that it would become a communist government, a communist nation, and that was absolutely unacceptable by the United States at that time. Okay, closing here, we're going to talk just briefly. I want to talk a little bit about the document you read by Kwame Nkrumah, who is a very important, deep voice of decolonization in this case. And I want to start with Nkrumah's definition of neocolonialism, which is expressed pretty well at the top of your reading. And what Nkrumah puts forth is a definition that says neocolonialism is sort of the post-decolonization method in which European countries deal with their former colonies. And essentially means it's neo-colonialism, meaning near, almost colonialism. That's what neo means. It's neo in the sense that technically the country has been liberated from its past colonial status. So technically the government is no longer controlled by foreign countries. However, the reason it's still near colonialism is that effectively the economy of this newly liberated country is now being highly managed and highly controlled by foreign governmental influence. And so in some respects, neocolonialism refers to how these newly decolonized countries still maintain a role of helping former colonial, former imperial countries run their economies and continue to create prosperity out of their former colonies. And the ways in which this happens, which is a lot of what this document that Nkrumah provides to us, is that the forms and principal methods, there are going to be conditions placed upon the money or aid that's given to these countries by their colonial, their former colonial powers. And so unless the countries agree to operate in ways found, if appropriate, they will then be